Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I'd like to welcome you to 2023 as we embark on Humanity Rising ongoing coverage of world affairs in a way that supports all of us building community, but also seeking for solutions in our very chaotic and troubled world. I hope all of you had a warm holiday, those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, and it wasn't too hot in the Southern Hemisphere. We know that we have registered participants from over 130 countries on Humanity Rising. So wherever you are, I just want to welcome you into 2023 with best wishes for the upcoming months as we all together seek to understand as deeply as we can what's happening in our world, and seek as deeply as we can to fathom a way forward that deepens our sense of connectedness with the larger ecology and brings into the world the kinds of solutions that can bring abundance and health and greater alignment with the natural order. We're moving into our third year as Humanity Rising. You'll remember back in May of 2020 when we started, the world was engulfed by the pandemic, and almost simultaneously with the deepening pandemic was the killing of George Floyd. And that captivated the world. And on Humanity Rising, we had many programs on the issue of society and race. And then as we rolled into 2021, we emphasized at the beginning of the year the importance, as we were still under lockdown and we were still in social isolation, the importance of community. And we spent most of 2021 really discerning, how do we build community so that we can be supportive with one another, even in isolation? And the fact that we had Zoom and we had the internet and we had the capacity to be with one another virtually was an extraordinary gift that we embraced, even though we knew that virtual connectivity is not quite the same as in-person connectivity, but intimacy can be gained in very interesting and sometimes mysterious ways. And then when we went into 2022, you may recall this time last year, we enunciated the theme of inner regeneration, because it was clear that after a couple years of the pandemic, people were suffering and people were depleted and people were bewildered and people were looking for some way to rejuvenate themselves. So we had numerous programs on regenerative health and how using natural means, practical means, easily accessible means, we can fortify our immune systems, we can build up our health, we can increase our spiritual empowerment so that from the inside out, we can be empowered. Today, as we begin 2023, the focus is shifting fundamentally to the question of war and peace. And so for the next 2 days, we're going to be focusing on the conflict in Ukraine. As many of you know, I've done a blog and a video in the spirit of a teach-in on Ukraine because Ukraine, in my judgment, and I think in the judgment of many people, is bringing the world into its most dangerous moment in our lifetime, certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago in 1962. So that's what we'll be exploring today as Humanity Rising embarks in its 2023 program and calendar. I'll be saying a little bit more as the program commences about what we have in store as Humanity Rising continues to evolve toward the Humanity Rising Network. But before we jump into our program, let us just pause, as we always do as we begin our sessions, to create a community of coherence by breathing together as one. So in a moment, Georg will have another scream. You'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the bell, just breathe in slowly for about 5.5 seconds. You'll hear another bell and just breathe out slowly for 5.5 seconds. We're going to take 10 breaths together in opening our hearts to one another and breathing as one. Welcome, everybody. Let us breathe together. Thank you, everyone. I just want to note the comment that Mary Thorpe put in the chat while we were breathing. It was very powerful. Mary, thank you so much. She said, "I'm thankful for the gift of Humanity Rising as the place where possibility stayed alive publicly. It's how I stayed healthy. Being in this community was and is a place of life and spirit. And so I want to say, Mary, I agree completely. Being on this program day after day is a powerful experience, I think, for all of us. And it's been one of the joys of my life, just every day being with you all as we've covered every conceivable subject. It's one of the things I've loved about Humanity Rising is there's no boundaries to the human experience. And there's been no boundaries to what we've covered, all within the spirit of how do we enable humanity to rise. And over the next several months, we're going to be covering a range of issues as we have over the last 2.5 years. And it's been in the spirit of what I would call Socratic dialogue, very deep in the DNA of Ubiquity University, which brought Humanity Rising into public attention. and formation is the Socratic admonition that it's always better to live in questions rather than in answers, in truth pursued, not truth possessed. And I think it's that humility that has allowed us to explore so many areas so deeply, always by affirming the importance of dialogue, but also affirming the importance of looking issues right in the eye. And by doing so, to illuminate concerns that people have in a dialogic way. And as we turn over this next 2 days to the question of war and peace in Ukraine, we want to comport ourselves in the same spirit. Life, history, human beings are infinitely complex. And so we need to approach all issues, whether the death of George Floyd or the storming of the Capitol on January 6th of 2021, or anything that's been happening in the ecology in a spirit that we don't know as much as we would like. And in the end, we're all blind people trying to figure out what the elephant in the room is. And that's the humility that we try to embrace. And at the same time, we take stands. We took a stand on George Floyd. We took a stand on democracy. And we're taking a stand on Ukraine, that peace has to come. Because if it does not, we are going to probably end up in nuclear exchange. And so I did that blog, I did that teach-in, that video, and for today and tomorrow, we want to summarize many of the things that I said, but also focus, as we always do, on solutions. So in just a little bit, I'll be bringing in someone who's been working passionately for peace for many decades to talk about how organizations around the world are starting to mobilize for peace in Ukraine. But before we do that, I want to set the context for what it is that is happening. When I say that the war in Ukraine is bringing the world to the most dangerous moment in our lifetime, certainly since 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, what I mean is the following. Right at the moment when the most urgent global national security issue is how the nations of the world and the people of the world come together to solve our climate crisis, what we are choosing to do instead is go to war between arguably the two most powerful nations on earth, heavily defended both by massive arsenals of nuclear weapons. And doing so in a way that has completely eliminated any possibility or capacity to solve the critical issues of ecological turbulence at a global level. And that, my friends, is a recipe for suicide. And I want to just think about this for a couple of minutes as we begin 2023 by emphasizing the gravity of this situation in the following ways. If you think about it just in abstraction for a moment, we're in the process of destroying infrastructure in that one country in the world that is called the breadbasket of Europe. We're bombing, destroying infrastructure deliberately intentionally in an escalating way, while simultaneously climactic turbulence is destroying infrastructure all over the world. And the momentum toward war is seemingly unstoppable. And the momentum of climate turbulence also is unstoppable, because we're not mobilizing against the climate disasters that are happening, because we're too busy fighting each other in Ukraine, and doing so in a way that's not only destroying Ukraine, but is destroying the very global infrastructure that the world so desperately needs for any kind of cooperation. The climate issue is now off the table. But that doesn't mean it's going away. And so when we think about how we understand the war in Ukraine, we need to understand, first of all, that it has global implications, unlike any war in our lifetime. When the United States invaded Iraq, for example, or Afghanistan, those were local wars in regions of the world. And even though the diplomatic fallout was significant, the context of the war was essentially limited. In Ukraine, we have a completely different situation on our hands. We have a situation in which the entire world now is refashioning the infrastructure of coalitions that are being radically transmuted because of the increasing conflict going on between the two major powers on planet Earth right now. And that brings us to some situations that we've never confronted before, which, like the pandemic, are unique and need to be dealt with in a very, very serious way. So one of the things that we're going to be doing on Humanity Rising as the year unfolds and as the war unfolds is we're going to be doing a series of summits on Ukraine. The first one's going to be between the 27th of February and the 3rd of March. And every 6 weeks or so, we're going to be bringing more illumination to what is happening and all around the demand that we as the people of the world need to make, that we need an immediate ceasefire. And we need a summit of all parties to talk this through diplomatically, rather than continuing to escalate this war. Nothing is more important than stopping the war in Ukraine, because unless and until we stop the war and fashion the peace, we're not going to be able to make any headway on these other issues. And that cannot be overstressed. So whatever you think about who's responsible, whatever you think about the Russians, whatever you think about Vladimir Putin, I would urge us to put our personal opinions about the war within the larger context of an exchange that, if not stopped immediately, could well spin out of control and escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. An analogy, just to help us think about it just for a quick moment, and I'll be talking more about it tomorrow, is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Just imagine if over Cuba, the United States and Russia, it was then in its Soviet period, had gone to nuclear war. We wouldn't be here. Europe would have probably been destroyed, in most of North America and most of the Eurasian landmass. Cuba was not worth the destruction of the earth. and neither is Ukraine. There's a fundamental difference between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the crisis in Ukraine that I think it's important for us to draw to our collective attention. And that is that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union brought nuclear weapons and missiles to Cuba, about 90 miles off the Florida coast. And the United States went apoplectic and almost went to nuclear war. And had it not been for the elegance of John Kennedy, who was president, working with Adlai Stevenson, who was the ambassador to the UN, and Robert Kennedy as the Attorney General, nuclear war would have probably happened. That was the recommendation of the Secretary of Defense. That was the recommendation of the Secretary of State and most of his cabinet, that what was going on in Cuba was so dire that it was worth going to a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. And we missed that by a hair's breadth because of the elegance of the presidents. In Ukraine, the situation is reversed. The United States has been pushing NATO farther and farther to the east until the Russians have said this is an existential threat. So you have a situation where the Russians are saying they're going to use nuclear weapons to protect Crimea. And they're not kidding. That's the situation that has been engendered as the irresistible force of US NATO expansion has met the immovable object of Russian nationalism. In that contradiction, what we have as we begin 2023 is the United States has now earmarked over $100 billion, as of last week, $112 billion to escalate the war on the US NATO side. And the Russians are now mobilizing upwards of 500,000 troops. On the Russian side. And in the middle, Ukraine is being destroyed. And there's virtually a complete absence of opposition at any kind of meaningful level about what's going on. You remember during the war in Iraq, there were millions of people that were protesting all over the world to say, you stop this war. With George Floyd, there was more protest over the death of George Floyd than any time in history about a single issue ever. And it brought issues into the public domain, but around Ukraine, the most dangerous moment, there's virtually nothing going on except isolated expressions, but nothing approaching the magnitude of what needs to take place in order to bring the kind of pressure to bear on these major powers that are now locking in to a conflict that is escalating day by day. And that's why we're bringing it up. And that's why we want to talk about it. And that's why we want to mobilize around it. And that's why we'll continue to bring it to people's attention so that we begin to understand, like with climate change, it's clear that the governments aren't going to do anything. That was clear several years ago in Glasgow. That was the consensus of the environmental movement. It was no longer reasonable to assume that the governments were going to actually do anything. And we, the people, have to now stand up and make our demands, knowing that unless and until we do, the governments aren't going to take the kinds of actions that are required. Similarly, with the situation in Ukraine, the governments are locked in. The Russians are not going to back down. And it doesn't look like the United States and NATO are going to back down either. And nuclear exchange, therefore, day by day becomes more probable. And we need, as the people of the world, as humanity, to understand the gravity of the crisis that we're in and take those kinds of actions required, independent of who you think is at fault, independent of who you think is to blame, and just demand collectively that we need an immediate ceasefire and we need a pathway to peace. Let me conclude by saying this is all possible. Stopping this war is completely possible. We're in a Jean Monnet moment. If you remember back at the end of the Second World War, the French diplomat Jean Monnet came up with this idea that people that had been killing each other by the millions in Europe could actually sit down together and build the European Union. And in a very short order, Germany and France, powerful enemies, became colleagues and friends. And I say this because I want to offer out that the American-Russian relationship is the most important relationship in the world right now to heal. If you look back over the last 75 years, it's been the conflict between the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union, that has been the heart of most of the conflicts around the world. That was the Cold War. That Cold War ended in 1989, but it continued by other means and now has erupted again in Ukraine. So whatever we can collectively do to bring healing to the relationship between America and Russia at this moment is of critical importance to the ongoing viability of humanity on planet Earth, because a nuclear exchange at this moment of environmental ecocide is not something from which we'll easily return. So I want to appeal to all Americans. I want to appeal to any of you listening from Russia to think, how can we re-galvanize citizen diplomacy? How can we learn to love the Russians like right now we're loving the Ukrainians? How can we pivot with Russia to end this war and begin a process of creating a common security and economic zone that would encompass Western Europe and Eastern Europe and the Eurasian landmass? It's perfectly possible. If the Germans and French can do it after the Second World War, the Americans and Russians can do it in the aftermath of Ukraine. So I wanted to just be a little provocative as we started this morning. I wanted to make a series of points that I hope we'll all just think about in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed, and all with an emphasis on what we can do to generate a momentum toward peace in this critical time. And to help do that, I want to welcome to our program Jody Evans, who is the founder of Code Pink. Jody has been an activist on issues of peace and equality and social justice for decades. Really, I've known and respected her for a very, very long time. And Code Pink will be working with Humanity Rising and a coalition of groups that we're in the process of putting together to convene this series of summits on Ukraine. And so, Jody, I want to welcome you to the program. And Jody will tell us a little bit about herself, a little bit about Code Pink, but then also just talk to us about all the different small little initiatives that are now beginning to emerge And the purpose of our collaboration is how do we bring all these together in a single voice to bring peace in that region before things get seriously out of control. So Jody, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. I think you're going to have to start my video since I can't.
Oh. Now, how do I, Georg, how do I start her video? There she is. There she is. There you go. Welcome. Welcome.
Welcome and good morning, everyone. And yes, I want to agree with Hyacinth. We need to be teaching love and peace instead of hate, which we're just drowning in. So thanks for contextualizing what's happening, Jim, and lovely to meet all of you who have spent time together actually sharing and learning. And I love that it's the Socratic method, the thing that is so missing in most of the West, which is where people think they know instead of where we question and learn. And at Code Pink, that's what we do. We educate, inspire, and activate. And the first casualty of war is truth. And we are in the fog of war. It is manipulation on steroids. And that's another thing we haven't seen in history is, yes, there has always been propaganda. Yes, it's always been thick. And, you know, this is no different than any of the other playbooks that have taken us to war. But I've been a peace activist for over 50 years. And what we don't see is anything that talks about the costs of war or anything in journalism that questions what's happening right now. And as Jim said, yes, this is seen by the world as the war between Russia and the US. They can pretend different in US propaganda. And it has also realigned the world. When the United States put sanctions on Russia, two countries that had spent billions of dollars manipulating so that it could have power over, Brazil and India, both leaders who'd been brought to power with the same methods and from the same people as who brought Trump to power, they looked and they went, oh, we don't trust this at all. They'll turn against anyone. They'll shut down anyone. And so, you know, one of the tools of war that leaves a lot of casualties, but not a lot of dust and destruction are sanctions. It just kills people. And for some reason, the United States government thinks, even though it's never been true, that sanctions will affect those in power. And instead, it only increases the power of those in power and hurts the people. So that was the first thing we saw with this war, was that it sent everyone globally into new corners. And so we have a new non-aligned movement that we haven't had, you know, since the 90s or 80s, and it's growing. BRICS had fallen apart and it's back together. BRICS, the balance to the unipolar world of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And now I think there's some 14 other countries that want to be included in BRICS. So there's another thing happen as our media focuses on a war and hate. Other things are happening around the world, including, as Jim said, starvation in Africa. This war does affect the globe. So education, talking to each other, not hating on each other, listening to each other, trying to understand something that I remind all of us that those up close and personal, those that actually have the levers on this war, don't understand. That we've heard from generals, we've heard through history, that when it's happening, you're also in your own fog of war. So as we try to understand something, I always pull back what I call out of the weeds, out of the things I don't have my hands on. and try to find out what I do have capacity to touch, and therefore what I can do. Because we can argue the details and the language and what's happening on and on, but it's not going to solve the problem. Many of us don't have our hands on the levers of power. What we do have is the capacity to raise up our voices for peace and love. That we always have capacity for. And so another thing we know at Code Pink, and I just want to say a little bit about Code Pink. Code Pink was a call. Bush was frightening the American people with color-coded alerts, orange, red, and yellow, to start an illegal, immoral, unjust, unconstitutional war on the innocent people of Iraq. And a bunch of us women met in Washington, D.C., and we raised our voices and we said Code Pink for peace instead of for war and hate. Code Pink for love, for humanity, for cooperation. That was thousands of women outside of the White House for 6 months saying no war. We got Nancy Pelosi to turn against leadership and break with leadership and come against the war. We got senators to break with their leadership and come against the war. We were arrested over and over and over inside the halls of Congress. I was arrested the day that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was having a hearing about the Iraq War, and Biden was the chair. And he said, well, I guess we have to bomb Iraq to peace. And I stood up and I said, you're insane. And he had me arrested. So we disrupted every day for just that 6 months, and then for many years to go beyond that, to just try to stop the occupation and calling for an impeachment of the people who had taken us to this illegal, immoral war. So Code Pink has continued to educate around Iran, around Saudi Arabia, around drones, around what the United States government is doing against its people, educate about the cost of war to our planet, that there is no greater contributor to climate chaos than war. If we don't end war, it doesn't matter what else we're doing. We've raised up Palestine and the violence against Palestine, the basic almost genocide against the Palestinian people right now. So we've continued to raise up the violence of the US empire. We're almost at Martin Luther King Day, and the spirit and on the waves of his voice, we continue our work. And the same with Gandhi, and that we are nonviolent direct peace activists. So often when we show up to speak, violence ensues because the people don't want to hear about peace when they're in the middle of war. So right now, in the last 9 months, last 10 months, we have been educating because it gets confusing when you're out in the streets right now, because you've got Ukrainians calling for more war in the streets. And so we go to farmers markets, to places where people gather. We have teach-ins, and we have everywhere we can be. We're trying to pull people off of what I call their empathy, being captured by the war machine and turned against themselves and others. That the way the propaganda works is by grabbing your empathy. I've watched peace activists, people who've been peace activists for their entire lives, think that sending weapons to Ukraine is helping Ukrainian people, instead of the fact that it will kill more Ukrainian people. That we've been so convinced that this is the right thing to do. The people are afraid to call for diplomacy right now. People on the left are afraid to call for diplomacy because people on the right are calling from it, instead of that diplomacy is the only way a war ever ends. That we've lost our minds in how to think about things in relationship to human beings. I just want to also remind that the last 22 years of the war on terror have cost $21 trillion. And we see that in the United States. We see that in the coalition of the willing countries on what it has done in regards to hate, what it has done to the infrastructures of our countries. In the United States, that's 65% of your tax dollars that you've decided to destroy the world and other people with. So, it's thick. So we feel we have to have a lot of compassion for people right now, and education is what is necessary. We also go into action every month across the country and raise up our voices. But we know that right now, when it's a fog of war, when people are lost, when people are being used, the most important thing is to educate. And my partner, Medea Benjamin, wrote a book, and she's on a 100-city book tour. And we were kind of worried about the book tour, like, because of the attacks that we were getting and the death threats we were getting. But really what we found is that people are just grateful to know that once you give people something strong to stand on, something true and real to stand on, that they know that's historical, or that they can research and find the facts, they feel more grounded. And that there's a way that in the fog of war, it's our ungrounding in any real facts and any truth that we can rely on that allows us to continue to be used by the propaganda. Like 3 years ago, I started what I call China is not our enemy, because I noticed the exact same playbook being used against China as Iraq. I could look at any newspaper and the same words were being used, the same, only 2 people you could find that would say what was being said. And so over the last 2.5 years, we've been educating on China, because all I could find was hate on China and no real information. And so again, it's like educating, because when I see hate, I'm like, that's a tool. That's not information. That doesn't help me connect. That doesn't help humanity. So why is hate being used? But the thing about China is that the casualties of this war on China already exist, and they're in the United States of America. They're Asian Americans, because nobody can tell the difference, who have been attacked, and the violence against Asian Americans has steeply increased. And so it's been about 2.5 years of educating to get people who are also being used, their empathy being used, to pull back, to understand how they were being used and why. So because the Pentagon felt they were going to be able to use progressives' hearts to drive this war. So one of the things that we've done besides the teach-ins and rallies is that we work to get 30 members of Congress to call on Biden to use diplomacy. And when I first asked Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal to do this, she's one of the co-founders of Good Pink, she said, great, yes, no problem. And then a month later said, every time I raise the letter, I have to get under my desk, I get so attacked. So it's important for us to note that the violence that comes back at people who are actually calling for peace. You can talk to Cori Bush or AOC, but it's literal violence. And also someone came to Pramila's house with a gun, and she has a son, so she has to move now. So what it is to be a progressive member of Congress right now is a very courageous act in itself. So then finally, she got the letter up enough that she could get a few signatures on it. And then we started as a coalition. We have many Ukraine coalitions, one inside the Beltway and then one of activists outside the Beltway. So with our inside the Beltway coalitions, we started working with our members of Congress. I've worked on many letters. This was the hardest letter ever. And we as Code Pink decided not to join the letter, not to endorse the letter, because it said weapons were good, and we don't believe weapons are good. So we worked on getting all the members that support us to get them to sign on. Part of the story was the letter is so bland, it's so not strong that we're not even on the letter. So it's not a big deal. You're just asking for diplomacy. You're not doing anything else. We got 30 members to join. And on Friday, when I told the team that it was going to go on Monday, that we needed to be really prepared, that it was going to be a shit show, because this is peace showing up in a room, which usually, we have a t-shirt that says the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. We know that when we tell the truth, sometimes we have to just duck and cover for a little while until it becomes commonly accepted. Well, the day the letter dropped, Nancy Pelosi told Pramila Jayapal she had to pull it. She'd already delivered it to the White House. So of course, pull the letter. And the cool thing was that in pulling the letter, a letter that the media would have never talked about, it created tension between members of Congress, and so got lots of global attention. And then for the first time, we started to hear the conversation about diplomacy. We started to hear it across the world and in the halls of Congress. But since that letter and since it being pulled in the beginning of November, we're not hearing anything except from one member of Congress that I encourage all of you to reach out to in deepest gratitude, and that is Congressman Rokana. Congressman Rokana has been the lead on the War Powers Act against Saudi Arabia and ending the war in Yemen, which, by the way, when you hear about all the horrible things that Russia are doing, which are truly horrible, because using weapons and killing people, in my heart, is always wrong. The United States weapons have just killed almost 400,000 people in Yemen. So also, when speaking, we should also be aware of the place from which we speak and what we represent and what our tax dollars are used for. So Congressman Rokana right now is still the only person really speaking out about diplomacy. He carried the War Powers Act to 3 victories votes in Congress. Just again, the War Powers Act has gone through and Biden is holding it, and has told Bernie Sanders he can't bring it forward because he won't sign it. So just a reminder about the warmongering of the White House that we have. After we did that, we called for a Christmas truce and got over 1,000 religious leaders to join in. Reverend Barber did a fantastic Christmas Eve sermon on the issues. If any of you want to listen, it's on the Repairs of the Breach YouTube. Powerfully touches on all the issues of what's happening, including, as Jim said, this is the closest we've been, the second away from a nuclear war. So in the next coming months, we feel after the education, we're ready to hit the streets. We've got many things happening, including on Martin Luther King Day. We have 5 days of events across the country and across the world. And those are, some are Zooms. One you can sign up for on diffusenuclearwar.org, another coalition Putin's part of, with all the anti-nuclear organizations. And that will be on Thursday, the 12th. Speakers like Reverend Liz Theo Harris and Pastor Michael McBride and Dan Ellsberg and Norman Solomon and the amazing Nina Turner and Katrina vanden Heuvel, who's the publisher of The Nation, and also her husband, her late deceased husband, has been an expert on Russia all of his life. And so this has become very close to Katrina's heart. So that's January, and February is the first anniversary of the beginning of this war. There are actions planned across the country. Code Pink has picked Valentine's Day, Have a Heart, Diplomacy Not Bombs, but also on February 24th, the actual anniversary, we're asking people to do local rallies, not rallies, but candlelight vigils to honor all the dead and all the costs of the war, which are global. They don't just reside between Ukraine and Russia. In March, we're taking on International Women's Day as a global day of action, calling for diplomacy with events around the world. And Jim talked about the anti-war movement. It's much, much larger in Europe, in England, in France, in Germany, in Spain, in Italy. And we've seen tens of thousands of people on the streets, and new organizations against the war are coming together every day. And so we're partnering with all of them. The goal is to have a global call that the world says, the people of the world say no to war. And we're not having them really be as much marches and rallies as disruptions of the day, that this is not okay. And we live in a war economy, and war serves that war economy, and that we have to understand that. And so, where can we disrupt the war economy, or where can we disrupt, things that bring us back to the war machine in some way? At Code Pink, we were taking over the Hart Senate building, as we've done many times before, with the the John Lennon, Yoko Ono song, War is Over If You Want It, with banners hanging from all the balconies. April will take over Earth Day. If you don't end war, it doesn't matter what you do. War is the greatest contributor. War is not green. Also, something that needs to be educated on. There's so much to know about that. We've done many webinars at Code Pink that you can find. We have scientists around the world who've done the studies now. We had a project called Cost of War at Brown University, and one of the professors there started looking at emissions, and now she's moved to England. We've been in the streets of Glasgow with her, but she and many other scientists have pulled together a website where you can be super educated on what the costs of the war and the military and these amounts of your tax dollars that are going to war in the military and weapons, and how they are literally destroying the planet that you live on. In May, we're calling activists from around the world to meet in Vienna and create a global call for diplomacy with something signed by everyone that's there. And then we'll move from there to major capitals of NATO and to Kiev and Moscow and DC to deliver this. We know from experiences that wars are hard to stop. So Russia says it's ready for diplomacy. It's up to us to pressure if we're in a NATO country or Zelensky or Biden. It's up to everyone to call their member of Congress and call for diplomacy. And just this today and last week, someone paid for Medea's book to be delivered to every member of Congress and the Senate, so she's hand delivering it. There's Jim's amazing talk. There's so many people. If you feel like not strong in this, there are so many links that I could send to Jim where you could go and listen to experts. But as peace activists, we work to be visible, to disrupt the lies, to comment whenever we can in the media on where we see someone being used by a lie, whether it's a comment in social media or writing a letter to the editor or commenting on an article, that if we let something happen, and we try to have this conversation in the same way Jim said earlier, is as a conversation. Did you know? Can I tell you something more? And understanding that sometimes when you drop a piece of truth, the first thing you get back is not a gratitude. So we've got the Peace in Ukraine Coalition that anyone can join and take on a role and help us strategize actions. At Code Pink, we're engaged every day across the country and now in Congress every day, which just opened up because Nancy Pelosi is gone. And as the Republicans said, it was she who was keeping it closed so that the people can now come in and their voices can be heard. Please, P for peace, actively, visibly.
Thank you so much, Jody. As always, you're just a fountainhead of activity and all kinds of inspiring activities around the world. So I just want to acknowledge your extraordinary life and your extraordinary dedication to peace on Earth. It's really a profound example of how all of us should be around these issues. Let me just ask you a couple of questions just to illuminate. One is that I didn't catch the congressman that you said was it Rouhana?
Rouhana.
Rouhana. Rouhana, there we go. Several people wanted to follow up with him.
For peace, there is no one who has done more for peace as a member of Congress who really, really, really fought and made something happen that Nancy Pelosi said she would never let happen. And that was the War Powers Act, which the Congress has the right to question a president when they've gone to war. And so that War Powers Act has been now passed through Congress 4 times. And Trump didn't sign it 3 times, and now Biden has said, don't put it on my desk because I won't sign it, which is really, really sad. 400,000 Yemeni dead from US bombs.
400,000.
Yeah. It's really horrible. It's really horrible. We have bombed schools and school buses and it's the US that's done the flying and the navigating and the targeting, and it's just horrific. And so, I just, one thing, just for, I say things that when we talk about this, we need to talk from the deepest places of our hearts, because it's very scary. And the time we live in is kind of frightening. So I always say just to be in care of everyone I talk to. But the way the United States and the West is being around this war in Ukraine is felt by the rest of the world, the people of color of the world, as so racist. And you need to know that if you are a white person, that this is so racist, that the things people say, the way people are behaving, the fact that the United States has bombed and killed close, like 1.5 million people in the last 20 years using taxpayers' dollars of $21 trillion to murder and destroy the planet, and that people are cheerleading a war on white people. It's like, and showing up to help white people, when right now women in Afghanistan can't go to school, where we have literally destroyed a country there, where the Taliban had been reintegrated into Afghanistan in 2009. I went there, I brought 4,000 signatures back from the women asking Obama not to accelerate and escalate, which started a whole nother, hell on earth. People of color, Iraq, 1 million people killed, an illegal, immoral, unjust war where the people that did it are still walking the streets. There's a guy teaching law at Berkeley that approved torture. I mean, we can't be surprised where we are, and because we don't hold anyone accountable for the violence and the destruction and the lies. And so the lies get thicker and we're in it. But we all need to be conscious of the racism of this war and how it is seen globally. And that at the UN, when the vote happened, the number of people that did not stand with the United States and NATO was more than 50%, and they were people of color. And you must be aware of that.
Very profound point. Thank you for that. And as you said earlier, there's a whole reorientation of the global non-aligned movement now that's being energized by this war, and I think is emerging now with a solidity and a common purpose that certainly didn't exist during the Cold War and the non-aligned movement then, where they were just non-aligned. But this time they're organized, and they're focusing on eroding the primacy of the US dollar by getting Saudi Arabia, who's now joined that BRIC plus coalition, so that the sale of oil will no longer exclusively be in US dollars. And I'll be saying a lot more about that tomorrow when I go over some of these matters. But thank you for raising it, because it's basically the perception about Ukraine and the war in the United States looks very differently from the developing world. And they're done with what I think is obvious of essentially 30 years of US militarism. And as I say in my blog, I believe that Ukraine will go down as that point where the world concluded that the US should no longer be recognized as a world leader, and that this is the death knell of Pax Americana. And we need to all take that in as Americans. I think that we're on very thin ice with the rest of the world, given what we're doing, and that we need to bring peace immediately for our own national security interests. That, if you look at it that way, in the way that you're framing it, it's very profound. So I want to thank you for that. I want to ask you also about just a comment that you made, which I think is really insightful, of how the Pentagon has been manipulating the left and the progressives to support the war. Say more about that, because that's a huge point.
Well, I first noticed it on China. So where I was like, oh, they're literally grabbing your empathy to hate on China. And so, they were talking about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, and there was one guy who's like a birther, who's the only person that could tell the story, who's paid for by NED, which is the Pentagon slush fund to, spread lies. And I was like, okay, but why would they do that? And then I realized, because as a progressive, your issue is human rights. So if you can drag up all these stories about violations of human rights, then you've got the whole left with you. They're for the human rights of, everyone, right? But human rights. So you're going to use human rights of Uyghurs, which, by the way, the entire Middle East supports what China is doing. The entire Middle East, every Muslim leader supports. Why? Because the United States asked the king of Saudi Arabia to radicalize the Muslims in China because that was its next way in. Let's not forget, by the way, that it was the United States CIA that was arming the Tibetans to fight against China that caused the death of many Tibetans. I keep saying, y'all, when the CIA and the FBI goes in, they don't care that they leave it so everyone there gets killed. So here you have, they've radicalized a group of warriors, and they are the Uyghurs are seen as the greatest fighters. The U.S. has killed more Uyghurs than the Chinese because we've droned many of their camps in Afghanistan. But they come home to China and they bomb the shopping centers and stuff. So that radicalization is being affected by Chinese government. I don't know how. I know governments are horrible. We tortured people in Guantanamo, but I've been to China. I see Uyghurs everywhere. They make the best food, and I dance with them in Sanya on the island, south of China. So it's complicated. But in that complication, what isn't complicated is the human rights of Uyghurs are being used to catalyze the progressives against China. And so, I say, really, we're going to go to war on a country of 1.5 billion with nuclear weapons because you're concerned about the Uyghurs? That's the death of how many people? More people than there are Uyghurs. I want you to think about it. Yes, I want the rights of Uyghurs. I want the rights of everyone on the planet. But I don't want those human rights being the reason that we're going to spend trillions of dollars going to war with China. Because I don't see you calling for the human rights of the women in Afghanistan or the people in Yemen, or for that matter, the people, the people in Africa that are starving. If we want to get to human rights, can we start somewhere and make it be a blanket that is global, not cherry-picked so we can be used? So with the war on Ukraine, it happened so fast, and it became about Ukraine as the Ukrainians were fighting for their, it became this, we're helping the underdog instead of we've set up something where we're responsible, where NATO is responsible for the lives of the Ukrainian people. And the last thing you want to do, like in Vietnam, like in Afghanistan, like in Iraq, is send more weapons. Weapons kill people. What do people not understand about that? Kill people, destroy the earth, and cause more damage that then has to be fixed. And we have literally black rock in Ukraine now rebuilding. And if I could tell you stories of US soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan about this whole rebuilding, boondoggle. So yeah, more weapons. How many members of Congress are owned by weapons manufacturers? That thing has changed in 22 years. The profits of Lockheed Martin are 70% your tax dollars. And I want you to know this is your tax dollars making the rich richer. It is literally taking money out of poor people's pockets and making the rich richer. It is just a vehicle. I produced a film so people could better understand this called Shadow World about weapons trade. And the really horrible, creepy weapons trader says, I don't know why they don't just, give each other the money instead of the weapons, because the weapons are really destructive. I mean, look at what we did bombing Libya. The violence in Northern Africa because of the bombing of Libya, a socialist country that took care of its people who are now struggling horribly. It's hell on earth. We did that. No, I just want to say I didn't do that. Hillary Clinton did that, but it's created hell on earth in Northern Africa. And one of my favorite countries, Mali, is now militarized. There's weapons everywhere. It's a plethora of weapons. And these weapons that the United States is sending to Ukraine have already found themselves in Northern Africa and the wars in Northern Africa. So yeah, because the heart likes simple answers. Oh, we can just go, like what brain thought we could just go to Ukraine and it was going to be over in a few minutes? That wars don't, once they're started, become monsters. But yeah, somehow that, yes, we're doing it. We're there to support. Zelensky's a rock star. And there we are. And Putin's, I mean, it's what these movies, these cartoon movies are doing to our brains with these superheroes, that you could so simplify what was happening in Russia and Ukraine into good guys and bad guys. Is a sign of how simplified our minds are. And, I want to say, when the world looks at the United States in an empire, you're dumb. Just, you have to accept it. Even though people in the United States think they're super smart, they're dumb because they're in an empire and they're fed all this propaganda. In China and Russia, people know they have propaganda. In the United States, people think they're getting the truth. And it's really sad. And the whole world looks at like, because inside an empire, you are as dumb as the empire. One of my taxi drivers said, I was talking about Biden wanting to be like the ruler of the world, and he listened to his inaugural address. And he said, doesn't he watch Star Wars? Doesn't he know empires are stupid? And I'm like, I think that's another thing to remember, is like empires are stupid. So like Jim just said, it's like a multipolar world is the world we want. It's the world that brings us peace. And it's the world that will keep peace. So we want that multipolar world that this has been a pivot towards, created by Biden himself. Yeah, the propaganda is thick. The Pentagon has figured out over decades and decades how to manipulate our minds and how simple it is. We watched it with Iraq. I mean, that this country was convinced to bomb an innocent country against everything, that one little lie in the UN that they knew was a lie. I mean, think about that. Think about that. And this propaganda is even more stellar. It's in your brains, it's in your hearts in deeper and more profound ways. So I, certainly encourage you, all of you, to, listen to what Jim just did. There are so many speakers out there. We've got it. I put the website up, A Peace in Ukraine. You can go there. We've done teach-ins over the last 9 months. Get Medea's book, or you can just look at the Code Pink website and watch her 20 minutes on it. Because we all have to be strong inside ourselves, because we live inside of the constant drone and infiltration of lies. And remembering that, and try to find where you feel you can go for facts that work for you, for the truth that works for you, where you can find in your heart something that aligns with something that you know, because we all need to be tuning forks for peace right now. People have forgotten about peace, and it is our job just to be literally a tuning fork in a room, attuned for peace.
Wow, Jody, thank you so much. And I want to just acknowledge again your insight. And as we close here, everyone, I think the point that Jody was just making about how easily we are in the heart of the beast, manipulated by the propaganda that we see every day on the mass media, is so important. I remember during the Cold War days, you had the free United States and the totalitarian Soviet Union. They did an analysis of the news reporting, and they concluded that about 98% of the reporting on the United States in the Soviet Union was negative, and about 98% of the reporting about the Soviet Union in the United States was negative. There was essentially a mirror image of negative messaging. The difference was, which Jody said, pointed out, and I just wanted to underscore, on the Soviet side, when I would go over to the Soviet Union, they understood that. And so the irony was they were free thinkers because they knew it was propaganda. But in the United States, thinking they were free, they were locked into the propaganda machine. And as Jody said, if you raised any questions, I've been called a communist so many times that, it was kind of shocking. In fact, during the Vietnam War, my father actually disowned me and threw me out of the house because I was opposing the war. That's how locked in people were then and are now around Ukraine, thinking that they're free, thinking that when they watch CNN or MSNBC or BBC News, they're actually getting the truth. They aren't. They're getting a messaging that, as Jody is saying, is very skillfully constructed using the latest information and research about how you influence through empathy, through subtlety, and through constant repetition of the same very simplistic image about the enemy on the other side. And once you've locked in to the enemy on the other side, all kinds of things are possible because you give permission for that struggle against that enemy. And as Voltaire said, one of the most important observations from Voltaire is that if you can get people to believe in absurdities, you can get them to commit any kind of atrocity. So one of the messages out of today, and I think is a good point with which to close, is when you watch the news tonight, question it. Why is just this one atrocity after another all blamed on the Russians? What am I supposed to be thinking? What do they want me to think about this? And if we can elevate our consciousness and detach it from the news media, we have then the space for the kind of real information that Code Pink and Jody and others are trying to bring to our attention. And Jody actually sent me Medea's book. I would recommend it to everyone. I'm about halfway through it. It's just a very dispassionate description of what's really happening. And once you read it, then when you look at the news, you're better empowered, you're more empowered to be critical in a way that breaks through the machine of information manipulation that is so present across the media in our world. So Jody, thank you so much for this. And by the way, as I said, Code Pink and Humanity Rising, Jody and I are going to co-moderate that summit on the first anniversary of the war for 5 days. And then we're going to be co-moderating subsequent summits. So Code Pink is going to be all over Humanity Rising, and we're going to be supporting all their activities and bringing the different events and teach-ins and actions to our collective attention, because 2023, if humanity's to survive, has to be the year of peace. So we're dedicating this year with Code Pink and Jody and all her compatriots and all the people all over the world who yearn for peace. We're going to work for peace, everyone. And with God's strength, we will prevail.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And just, everyone, it's not leadership for peace. You are it. We are it. Each person, we are it. And that space that, takes you back and makes you feel powerless, or it's what it's also set up to do. That's one of the things it tries to do. And how change happens is individually, it's through relationships. So it really is, you can leave this, like Jim says, go study if you don't feel strong enough in the facts, and then just be the tuning fork for peace. That butterfly wing, as we know, is what matters. And they want you to worry, they want you to argue. Like let me just say, they want you to feel powerless, to argue with each other, and to, think you don't know enough. Peace and love is the way. That, or you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be had all these conversations where Jim's quoting Voltaire. It makes me want to cry. Where you're steeped in humanity. That's all. It's to be that. That is what the world is missing right now. The war economy has gobbled us all down. And, to divest from the war economy and be peace and love, there is no greater thing that you can do. You do not have your hands on the levers of this war, but you do have a presence and relationship with other people's hearts. And that's where your power is. Please use it.
Tuning forks for peace, everyone. That's the bottom line. See you tomorrow. Thank you so much, Jody. Thank you, everyone. That brings us to a close for today. I'll see you again tomorrow for the second day of our teaching on Ukraine.